Good morning, good afternoon, indeed good evening. Apologies for those who are joining us for a second time. We had some technical issues there, but would like to welcome everyone to the Cobalt Institute's webinar looking at deep sea mining. The webinar is a first event in our 2022 conference series. Following the webinar today, we will be having our conference in Zurich in Switzerland on the 17th and 18th of May. And then on the 16th of June, we will be hosting a webinar on global chemicals management and chemicals compliance. Today's webinar, Deep Sea Mining, Bringing the Issues to the Surface, and we must thank our colleague Tom Fairley for the catchy title, is an effort by the Cobalt Institute to help understanding and facilitate a debate and a discussion about this critical issue. The fact that we have over 270 people registered to attend the webinar today, I think suggests the level of interest in this topic. Metals, including cobalt, are critical to the energy transition, and seabed deposits are increasingly being seen as a potential part of this equation. In our webinar today, we are joined by experts from both sides of this discussion, and we hope to be able to investigate some of the key questions that we are facing, including what are the risks and opportunities? What are the knowledge gaps that we need to address before we engage in potentially engage in mining at the seabed? And also, what is beyond environmental impacts? What are the questions and considerations we need to address for societies and communities potentially impacted by this activity? Before introducing the panel and launching the discussion this morning, I would just briefly like to say a few words about the Cobalt Institute. The Cobalt Institute is the global association representing the cobalt industry and the cobalt value chain. We exist to promote the sustainable and responsible production and use of cobalt in all of its forms and all of its applications. We do this by trying to act as a knowledge centre, hence the seminar today, so that anyone who is interested in cobalt would think about the Cobalt Institute as a resource and as a place to go and ask those questions. We particularly engage with government, regulators, the media, civil society on all questions around the extraction, use and ultimately recycling of cobalt. We're very much a membership-driven organisation, and today our members account for around 75% of the global cobalt market. Moving on to the webinar today, we are delighted to be able to sort of frame our discussion with a video from the Honourable Mark Brown, the Prime Minister of the Cook Islands. Following this introductory video, we will then engage with our panellists and have the debate around some of the issues that the Prime Minister's contribution will raise. So please enjoy and look forward to coming back in a few minutes when the video has been played.
Kia ora and warm greetings from the government and people of the Cook Islands. First, let me say how delighted I am to once again have the opportunity to participate in a Cobalt Institute event. Deep sea minerals and how we address the related challenges and opportunities sits at the core of many debates about the efficacy of harvesting the seabed resources of the deep ocean. We are a Polynesian nation made up of 15 islands located in the heart of the South Pacific, some 3,000 miles south of Hawaii. Tourism has for years been by far our biggest income earner, with many visitors enjoying the natural beauty and culture of our islands. COVID, of course, devastated our tourism industry, and while it is slowly beginning to recover, the pandemic provided the Cook Islands with stark evidence of how vulnerable we are to external shocks. However, our country's natural beauty and our vibrant culture is not our only resources. We are an ocean nation. Our ocean is the lifeblood of the Cook Islands. It sustains us. It provides us with a source of food and income. It is part of our identity. As people of the ocean, we care for it. We take its management as seriously today as our forefathers did 1,000 years ago, when they first settled our islands during the great voyages of discovery by the Polynesian seafarers who navigated our vast Moana Nui o Kiwa. For our forefathers and for us today, our role and responsibility as custodians of our ocean is important to us. 40 years of ocean research in our waters suggests that as much as 12 billion tons of polymetallic nodules, rich in valuable metals, are spread across the Cook Islands seafloor. Estimates of the cobalt contained in these nodules is in the region of 21 million tons, which is significant when you consider that in 2021, global cobalt production was about 170,000 tons. The demand for these minerals is growing. Sparked by the need to combat climate change, the world is focused on developing clean energy sources and transitioning to a low-carbon economy. In order to achieve this, the International Energy Agency estimated in 2021 that mineral supply for clean energy technologies will need to grow sixfold by 2040, and that cobalt supply will need to expand 21-fold. We know that the minerals located in our deep ocean could potentially help meet this need. Securing access to what is now strategic metals has never been more important. I note the lengths that battery manufacturers are going to ensure their access to the metals needed to produce batteries for electric vehicles. However, as we have seen in statements from some prominent car manufacturers, demand is also linked to how responsibly the resource is obtained. The challenge then is, how do we achieve this? How do we responsibly and sustainably obtain from the seafloor the metals necessary to facilitate the green transition? My government is committed to building a seabed minerals sector based on best principles and practices, supported by a robust legal framework and in harmony with our high environmental, social and cultural values. I believe that the keys for us achieving this are, firstly, improving our understanding of the marine environment. Secondly, developing and testing innovative technologies. Thirdly, science-based decision-making. Fourthly, putting in place robust regulatory frameworks. And lastly, bringing our people along on the journey. In the Cook Islands, we have recently issued our first ever seabed minerals exploration licenses. What we hope to gain from this, first and foremost, is a better understanding of our deep ocean environment. While from an economic perspective, it is important for our license holders to develop a more precise estimation of the resource in their allocated area. They too appreciate the critical importance of gathering environmental data, and with up to 2/3 of their exploration budgets focused on environmental research. This information will be fundamental for establishing an environmental baseline against which the impacts of mineral harvesting technologies can be measured. Indeed, the exploration licenses we have issued also allow license holders to develop and test their technologies in a controlled manner. They will be required to measure the environmental impacts of their tests, to understand the potential risks, and to develop mitigation strategies and refine their technological approaches. I've been pleased to hear of efforts made to date to develop technologies that minimize environmental impacts. All of this, I might add, is before we have even made a decision on whether to allow nodule harvesting. The onus is on our license holders to be innovative. We cannot change the environment in which they operate, but they can adapt their technology. I put this challenge to the industry. Be innovative. Bring your best game. The stakes are high, and those that develop the best technology will most likely be the ones that are successful when decisions are made. In the Cook Islands, we have adopted the precautionary approach to making decisions about the development of our seabed minerals resources. This aligns with our values and our Marae Moana principles, which have the primary purpose of protecting and conserving the ecological, biodiversity and heritage values of the Cook Islands marine environment across our entire EEZ. The information gathered during the exploration phase will be vital for ensuring that future decisions about whether to allow minerals harvesting to proceed are science-based. While the Cook Islands are in the early stages of exploration and decisions on whether to allow harvesting are still some way off, we need to look ahead. If it is demonstrated that seabed minerals can be harvested responsibly and sustainably with no serious harm to the environment, and we decide to allow it, we will need to make sure that a robust regulatory framework is in place to govern it. Through the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, we have a sound and rigorous legal regime within which the sustainable development of seabed minerals can take place, and with environmental protection front and centre. Furthermore, the Cook Islands has the benefit of learning from the experiences as well as the practices and processes of other jurisdictions. This includes from countries with deep seabed minerals in their waters, the international area governed by the International Seabed Authority, and also similar extractive industries both offshore and terrestrially. As the Prime Minister of the Cook Islands, I also have the added responsibility of considering our economic prosperity and the will of our people. This has meant that we have placed great importance on taking our people with us on this journey. Our licensing process was driven by Cook Islanders, and engagement with our communities is one of our key priorities. We have engaged with our communities on all of our islands, our schools, our traditional and religious leaders, and we have a responsibility to continue to do so in an open and transparent manner. We have made it clear to our license holders that they need to dedicate resources to providing trustworthy and useful data to help all our stakeholders make informed decisions. I want our people to be the best informed citizens in the world when it comes to seabed minerals. They need to have easy access to an extensive, fact-based body of knowledge so that they can form their own views and engage in well-informed, meaningful dialogue on our sector's development, which is ultimately for their benefit. In closing, it is clear to me that there will be many challenges to building a successful seabed minerals sector, and that overcoming them will require collaboration and understanding with all stakeholders, but especially with our Cook Islands people. It is my hope that we will see governments, civil society, industry, and our communities collaborating to develop this sector in a responsible and sustainable way for the betterment of humankind. I also understand that different aspects of the seabed minerals sector are more important to different stakeholders. Therefore, I'm glad that organizations like the Cobalt Institute are providing forums that bring the issues surrounding seabed minerals to the surface in a meaningful and constructive way. Thank you very much for your time. God bless you. Kia ora, kia manuia.
Well, I think the messages from the Prime Minister there really do touch on a number of the issues that we're hoping to address today, whether that be the knowledge and the research we have to conduct, whether that be around the regulatory framework that needs to be put into place, but also that notion, that idea of bringing populations with organisations as decisions are making, and that education. So I think it was a really interesting start to our discussion today. It gives me great pleasure now to be able to introduce our panellists, who will all speak for around 5 minutes or so, just to introduce their perspectives. And then once everyone has done that, we will move on to a discussion and debate, and certainly hope to involve our audience today. So on our panel today, we are delighted to be able to have, first of all, Winnie Ye, who is Lead Responsible Sourcing at the World Economic Forum. Following Winnie, we will have Jessica Battle, who is Senior Expert for Global Ocean Policy at the WWF. Jessica will be followed by Dr. Adrian Glover, who is Merit Researcher at the Natural History Museum in London. Hans Schmidt, who is the CEO and President of Ocean Minerals, will provide an industry perspective. Hans will be followed by Professor Alex Rogers, who is Science Director at REV Ocean and also a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Oxford. And then we're delighted and very thankful that Alex Rogers, who is the Seabed Minerals Commission at the Seabed Authority from the Cook Islands, has joined us in the middle of the night for her. But I'm really pleased to be able to have everyone welcome. As I said, we will ask the panel for sort of opening contributions of around 5 minutes. And I will give the floor to Winnie to kick off the debate today.
Good morning. I'm Winnie Ye from the World Economic Forum. Earlier this month, I published a paper that found that the decision-making on the potential deep-sea mineral exploitation cannot yet serve the best interests of the planet and its people, because the analysis identified significant gaps in knowledge, in stakeholder participation, and in consensus. Together, these gaps impede sound decision-making on deep-sea mineral stewardship. I lead the Deep-Sea Minerals Dialogue, where we're building an impartial space for dialogue and thinking from a metal responsible sourcing lens. Today, I'm here to present this paper, Decision-Making on Deep-Sea Mineral Stewardship, a Supply Chain Perspective. And within this heated debate, our paper does not aim to answer that big question on if mining should go ahead or not. That's not for us to decide. What this paper does is that it examines how we should decide and who should be involved in this decision-making process. So when you want to make sound decisions, you compare the outcomes of different choices and how much knowledge is there on these outcomes. Our paper found significant gaps in knowledge on the scale of the effects of mining. This means even though we can list the potential effects of mining, the environmental, social, economic, we do not know how big these effects could be. And knowing the scale is key for decision-making in this case. But you've heard this before, likely. So what's new here? Not all of these knowledge gaps are equal. For example, there are models that can predict how far sediment plumes can spread. But the knowledge on how these plumes can change the ecosystem in the seabed and the mid-water column is a bigger gap. And we know even less on how it will impact those communities that depend on the seas. So often, these areas with the bigger knowledge gaps are those that are more linked to the impacts we can feel. And what intrigued us more was that while many are talking about and working on filling these gaps in environmental knowledge, there's less attention on the knowledge gap to the very important question of, do we really need these minerals from the seabed? And without more knowledge to answer this question, even if you know how big the environmental and social costs are, you won't know if those costs could be justified. Then next, let's talk about stakeholder participation. And real-world decisions are often made without complete knowledge. So that's not what we're asking for. But in these cases without complete knowledge, it is key to have these potentially affected stakeholders at the decision table. So which stakeholders are included in the process now? And we looked at the stakeholders who are connected to the potential effects. They include the communities that depend on the ocean for their livelihoods, the citizens that may benefit from seabed mining royalties, and those communities that depend on mining on them today, among many others. Many of these stakeholders are not engaged in the decision-making now. As an example, there are 13 developing countries with land-based mining today that may suffer economic losses. They may also benefit from the royalty sharing the International Seabed Authority is creating. And of these 13, the majority of them have not attended those meetings in recent years. As you know, the decisions made now will affect these countries. So to have better, more inclusive decision-making, these stakeholders that may be affected need to have their say. We all need to help close these gaps. And the good news is our report provides specific recommendations to contribute to closing these gaps. We have recommendations for downstream manufacturers and metal trading markets. And we have for other companies along the metal supply chain to all contribute to closing these gaps. So finally, I come back to the question you've joined this session for. Should deep sea minerals be exploited? This is one of the biggest decisions of resource governance of our day. It's a debate with strong emotions. Yet to make sound decisions on deep sea mineral stewardship, we need knowledge and more participation. In conclusion, these gaps in knowledge and participation, they are significant. We need to close them faster. If we don't, it will be difficult for the decisions made on deep sea mineral stewardship to be accepted by society and by those companies who are looking through the responsible sourcing lens at these materials. The decisions made now may have lasting impact for generations to come. Now more than ever, sound decision-making is crucial. Thank you for your attention. Now I'm turning the mic back to Adam.
Winnie, thank you so much for, I think, what was an incredibly interesting overview, I think, of some of the key issues, particularly around, the knowledge gaps and that need for, stakeholder engagement, for stakeholder consensus. And also looking at some of the gaps around sort of the environmental, the social and the economic. And I think that really segues really nicely into our contribution now from Jessica Battle of the WWF. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. And in particular, thank you to the Cobalt Institute, but also to all the other panelists. I'm really looking forward to the discussion we'll have later on as well. So we are to discuss if we need and if we should open the deep sea floor to mining. And I have a very quick answer to that, which I will go into a little bit, and we'll touch a little bit about what Winnie was talking about, but I will try to not talk too much about the science because we have two amazing scientists with us here. So we'll hear much, much more from Adrian and Alex about the science. But my quick answer is no, we do not need to do so. And we must instead ensure that the ocean and the planet's natural environment as a whole is safeguarded and that all resources are used sustainably in the future. Obviously, this is a big debate and is much, much bigger than deep sea mining, but I think it's important that we think about that. We need to reform the way we are producing and consuming goods in our economy. So over to the ocean. It's widely understood that the ocean provides innumerable benefits to us humans through renewable ecosystem services. These include, as the Prime Minister said, food, climate regulation, carbon sequestration, and much more. And in particular, a healthy ocean is fundamental to many states and communities in the Pacific and along the coasts and on islands throughout the developing world in particular, but we shouldn't pretend that we're not also in the developed world dependent on a healthy ocean. And it's interesting to hear the Prime Minister talk about this and then to pivot to deep seabed mining as an industry of choice. Because the ocean is under pressure already from a multitude of stressors, from a multitude of activities that we humans are carrying out, both at land and at sea. And we have to ensure going into the future that the ocean is our ally in the fight against climate change and continues to provide food and other ecosystem services into the future. And I would really like to point out that minerals are not a sustainable nor a renewable resource. Mining extracts a finite resource and is not a sustainable activity and can never be. Anybody who read Harlem Brundtland's definition of sustainable development knows that very well. And harvesting, I find a very unfortunate term to use when it comes to minerals. We are talking about extraction, it's not harvesting, it is not a renewable resource, and I think that is important. Deep sea mining, if permitted, would cause significant damage to important and near pristine habitats that we know very little about, and it will do so at huge scales. Winnie is right, of course, in the report that the World Economic Forum has issued, that we know very, very little about this, but what we do know points to the direction of large-scale damage. The projected intensity and methods, as well as the three-dimensional scale of seabed mining, would cause these significant impacts and remove entire habitats. Species that they host, the nodules are actually habitat for species themselves. They're not clean black stones lying at the bottom of the sea floor. And the services they provide are also, of course, being impacted. And this would damage climate regulation, elemental cycling, very important in the ocean, provision of marine genetic resources. And if we lose these marine genetic resources, we might scupper discoveries for new medicines or for other interesting industrial applications in the future. And of course, impact culture and well-being of communities living along coast and islands. In the Clarion-Clipperton zone alone, an area covering 500,000 square kilometers is projected to be mined. And if you add to this the three-dimensional impacts of noise and pollution, in particular from the plumes, which are literally like dust plumes, imagine dust plumes in the sea, we would cover an area that is combining Spain, France, Portugal, Germany, and Belgium. And if you look at it three-dimensionally, it is several times the entire Himalayan range that is being impacted by these plumes. 24 hours, 7 days a week for 30 years, as these licenses, at least under the International Seabed Authority in the area, the international area, will be open for 30 years. So imagine that. And that's only in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. Such impacts would also be felt in other ocean areas where licenses for exploration have been granted already. And all these can be turned into exploitation licenses. And recent science, including by Dr. Diva Amon, who just released a paper about a month ago, together with about 30 other scientists, tell us that there is far too limited knowledge to make informed evidence-based decision-making. And I think that's really important. To make decisions to allow seabed mining to go ahead or not, we need evidence, and the evidence is just not there. We need much more independent ocean science, and possibly this needs to be done for several decades before we know enough in order to understand these ecosystems fully and the potential impacts of seabed mining that this large-scale removal of habitat and species would entail. And over the past few months, about 600 scientists from about 44 countries have raised concern and called for pause on seabed mining activities until we know more about the deep sea. And add to this the fundamental problems with the International Seabed Authority. I'm talking here about international waters. I'm not going to talk specifically about national waters. The International Seabed Authority is an organization set up under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to regulate seabed mining, but also to protect the environment from damaging effects of seabed mining. This is, in a sense, a conflict of interest. It's a dual task that the Seabed Authority has, and it doesn't have the resources to fulfill this dual mandate. There are very many important issues that need to be resolved, and just yesterday, an important investigative piece was published in the LA Times on many of the issues that need to be resolved in the International Seabed Authority in order to guarantee transparent and equitable governance of this international seabed, which is actually all of our common concern and interest. And meanwhile, we feel that the investments that we need now are not to go into technology to mine the deep sea floor, but instead to look at what else can be done in order to avoid opening up a new frontier to exploit minerals. And of course, we understand, I work for WWF, we work on many, many different issues. And of course, we understand that we need to reduce and stop our consumption of fossil fuels. And as such, we need a different energy system. But we shouldn't just be tinkering in the edges when we do this. We should really rethink the entire system, the entire provision of energy and transport that we are using as a society. And this includes switching to a circular economy and also, of course, transparency and strict regulations of land-based supply chains. The brands that were mentioned before that have signed on to a no deep sea mining statement know this very well. And some of them, I believe, are represented in the audience here today. And increasingly, and as late as last week, political leaders, including heads of state in the Pacific, so colleagues of the Prime Minister, joined increasing calls for a moratorium on deep sea mining because they are worried about the prospect of deep sea mining starting even within a couple of years. So my plea is to push pause, establish a moratorium on deep seabed mining to allow for science and the development of alternatives. I think we all know that innovation is happening. Battery chemistry, recycling, transport systems, all are being rethought. We need to look at that. Smart investors, I think, should look at such areas rather than financing distracting activities that perpetuate a status quo and a dependency on resources that we need to continuously extract for years to come. And the last message I'd like to give you for now is this. Deep seabed mining is actually not an oceans issue right now. It is a sustainable production and consumption issue, and getting that right is fundamental, or we will squander the opportunities for future generations to live healthy lives on a healthy planet. Thank you.
Jessica, thank you. I think that really, I think, was very clear, very strong messages from your perspective. I think you raise a number of questions, again, around the gaps in knowledge that we potentially have. Questions that come to mind already are, will we ever have enough knowledge? Things like that. So I think that really was very useful. And I think you touch on a lot of the issues that are there, which is really revolving around the science. And we're very lucky to have two leading scientists with us this morning to really discuss some of these issues from that perspective. So I'd really give the floor to Dr. Adrian Glover, who from the Natural History Museum in London, to share his perspectives for 5 minutes or so. Adrian, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. And lovely to be invited to this event and hopefully talk to you a little bit about some of the remarkable life and biodiversity that lives in the abyssal plains of the Central Pacific. I lead the Deep Sea Systematics and Ecology Research Group at the Natural History Museum in London, and actually been working on the Pacific abyssal floor for 20 years, almost since my PhD, studying the biodiversity of life there. And I thought it might be fun to sort of introduce a little bit of that to you and explain a little bit of the things that live there. It's a unique environment. It's 4,000 to 5,000 meters deep, very cold, very dark, characterized, as we know from the resource discussion we've already had, by these remarkable little polymetallic nodules sitting on the seabed. But alongside those, there is life. And ever since the voyages in the late 19th century of expeditions out to sea to study the deep sea life, we've known that actually all depths of the ocean there's rich biodiversity, and the deep sea Pacific is no exception. We spent the last 10 years studying the places already mentioned. I think Jessica mentioned the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which is a little to the north and east, or considerable amount to the north and east of the Cook Islands region we've already discussed. And this environment is absolutely vast. It's so mind-bogglingly vast. It's very hard to kind of get a kind of grip in your mind as to how enormous it is. It's effectively half of the world's, the planet's solid surface is abyssal plain muds. I always say if you were randomly subsampling planet Earth, you had a brief visit on your swing through the solar system, you might accidentally only take a sample of mud with a few worms in it and assume that characterizes our planet because it's such a dominant environment. And down there on the abyssal plain floor, there is small invertebrates, mollusks, little worms, crustaceans, sea stars, and things which we're sort of probably vaguely familiar with from shallow water environments. So they're evolutionarily quite closely related, but they're all unique species to the abyss. And I'll give you one way of sort of framing it is just to think about this environment in the context of other environments where you might want to get your resources. So, for example, if you were a big thing at the moment is, of course, wind energy. And in Britain, here in the UK, we're building offshore wind farms all the time. And those go out into the North Sea and off the coast of Scotland and England as well. And those environments we actually have quite a good knowledge of. These are places where we have lists of the species that live there, and we have knowledge of that environment. And the regulatory environment and so on is fairly well developed in terms of environmental concerns. Somewhere like the Pacific Abyssal Plain, we don't have that knowledge. There aren't lists of the things that live there. That's actually kind of what my day job actually is providing those lists. And in some ways, that means actually describing the species that live there. We've published in the last 10 years descriptions of several hundred species, actually, which live in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, genetically characterizing them using the DNA in their molecules, in their cells, and also the morphology of them. These are little worms and shells and crustacea and things. And one of the things that we do know is that the deep sea Pacific abyss is particularly biodiverse in the small fauna which lives in the mud. Larger animals, less so. You couldn't compare it, for example, to a sort of coral reef environment for fish diversity or something like that. But the small invertebrate animals living in the mud and on the nodules, as I think Jessica mentioned, are rich in biodiversity. And it's a very interesting system in some ways. It's probably most likened to it's very important to say it's not a desert, but it is similar ecologically, perhaps in some ways, to other desert-like environments. We have very low food availability, very low productivity, but actually high biodiversity. One example would be somewhere like the Southern African fynbos, the Karoo Desert regions of South Africa. It's a very low productivity system. There's very limited amounts of water and energy for life to exist, but the biodiversity is very high, and it's actually similar in the abyssal plains. And all of those things, of course, lead one to the sort of conclusion that you need to proceed cautiously when it comes to seabed mining and develop that understanding. And I guess if I was to diverge slightly from Jessica's view, I agree with much of what she said, but I think that has happened. It's actually kind of a remarkable story that in the 1970s, the Law of the Sea Treaty came together to actually stop seabed mining happening. It was pretty close to going to full-scale commercial efforts in the late 70s, and a combination of economic factors and regulatory factors slowed that right down and actually stopped it until such time that it was acceptable economically, legally, and environmentally. A little bit different in nation-state waters, and obviously the Cook Islands is now a unique potential there for survey and understanding. But I remain firmly on the side of understanding and knowledge and transparency and openness. And certainly, that's the path that we must go down. If we just take as a thought experiment that Jessica is wrong and that we do need the minerals, I don't know. It may be that you're quite right and we don't need those minerals, Jessica. I'm not an expert on whether we do or don't need cobalt. But let's just, as a thought experiment, assume that we do. It's a relatively simple question then, is whether or not it's better to get the minerals from somewhere like the seabed or from a terrestrial source. It's a simple question with a complex answer, of course, because it's not just environmental. There'll be socioeconomic and cultural and legal and all sorts of other issues as well there. But just to think about that from the environmental side, you essentially have to weigh up the pros and cons of mining from these different places, a terrestrial source where you might be have a whole range of impacts, and a deep sea source. And one of the challenges there, and just to sort of summarize and come together, is that this is where, from a decision-making policy side, it gets quite difficult, because traditionally when you're opening a resource, a mine in terrestrial environments, you do an environmental impact assessment. But most of the environmental impacts that are listed are things which affect humans and the people living in that environment, actually. Contamination of their water supply, problems with impacts on agriculture, impacts on local tourism, noise pollution, etc. These are all issues which are a potential for disasters and massive accidents, which we know happen in the terrestrial system. These are all things which affect humans, and it's very hard to translate those into the deep sea. And when you do, of course, the deep sea no one lives there, it doesn't provide any fisheries. Yeah, there's an indirect ecosystem services, and it's part of our planet's holistic, everything that, happens in the surface eventually sinks down to the seabed. But people don't live there, and it doesn't provide those sorts of services. So it's very hard to translate that. And I think we need to come up with a different set of criteria for the deep sea, where we think more deeply about what is the conservation value of a wilderness area and how we both protect it and access it. And it's not dissimilar from the same types of arguments that we have on land with our national parks and our wilderness regions, is that on the one hand, we want to protect the biodiversity in them, and on the other hand, to allow people to access it and see it and effectively have some degree of impact on it. the national parks in the UK, for example, are farmed. They're not wilderness regions. They're mostly areas where people extract resources. Yet we protect them, and we have legislation to do that, and we have access into them. Somewhere like Australia, which I just landed from this morning, which is why I'm slightly jet lagged, the national parks are very different. They're wilderness regions which are protected mostly from resource activity, but they are starting to allow people to go in there. So you have to think about different types of arguments and framing the argument differently, as opposed to a simple sort of pros and cons. And this is where knowledge comes into it. And we can provide that knowledge. We can provide the lists of things that live there and say roughly what the risk of extinction would be, et cetera, et cetera. But unfortunately, that doesn't provide the ultimate answer as to whether it's a green light to go ahead or not. And ultimately, that is a societal decision. Just the same way, we decide what level of access and exploration we'll have of other wilderness areas like the Arctic or the Antarctic. We have to make that decision in the deep sea. I certainly, I think we have to respect the right of nations like the Cook Islands to explore and understand that remarkable and vast, and it's a vast deep sea environment around the Cook Islands. We have to respect the right that they would want to understand that, and understand not just the resource value from a mineral point of view, but what the resource from a biodiversity point of view is. And that's incredibly important to remember as well, is that these are not just mineral resources, they are biodiversity resources that tell us not just providing food or potential drugs, but actually understanding how life can persist in the world's most remote ecosystems, and telling us stories of evolution of life on our planet, which is incredibly important. And it's really through survey and knowledge and openness and publication and discussion and all of those things, which I see happening, that we'll get to there. We'll get to that point where we can make a decision, and it inevitably it will be a decision with some level of risk, like all decisions are, and that's something that we all have to be engaged with and think about.
Thank you so much. I think you really brought some of the issues to the surface then, and ultimately that cost benefits almost analysis that we have to conduct with both the impacts and the potential benefits. I think it always, and I think this reflects from what Winnie and Jessica were saying, this reflects that need for knowledge, that need to understand what is happening. And I think our next speaker, Hans Smit from Ocean Minerals, can really, I think, give us a practitioner's perspective on the work that they're doing to build this knowledge, to help that understanding, to allow, I think, society and almost the human race to start making those decisions. So Hans, over to you for your perspectives.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you to the Cobalt Institute for this opportunity. Yeah, there have been some really interesting, perspectives and views put across, and all of them are very important. All of them are relevant. At Ocean Minerals and our subsidiary Mohana Minerals, that is focused on the Cook Islands, we take a fairly pragmatic view of where we're at. We look at the challenges that we face as a species on the Earth. We face these significant climate challenges. We know that we have to do this transition into clean energy. We know that the societal needs and the involvement of people and the views of the citizens of the Earth play an important role in the process going forward. But at the same time, we also take a fairly pragmatic view on this. In order to address these issues, there are some very practical challenges that we need to overcome. And this is where the demand for these various metals that are going to support the transition to the clean energy, to address all the issues that have been raised. What are the community impacts are going to be? How are people going to be benefiting? These are all things that we have to find solutions to. Now, one of the things that we're doing at Ocean Minerals and Mohana is looking at this from a slightly different perspective. We are not taking the traditional approach to how we are going to go out and look at these resources that we believe and firmly believe are essential for us to be able to do what is necessary in order to meet the climate change goals that are essential to make the world a better place and to have the generational impact that people are speaking about. So at Mahana, what we do is we focus on what is necessary to ensure that we can get to a point where a sustainable and reliable and responsible source of these metals can be produced in quantities and in volumes that allow the very clever people out in the world to develop technology and to make the transition to clean energy. And we feel it's our responsibility to make sure that this process happens in a manner that meets all the interests of our stakeholders. And our stakeholders are diverse. You know, we have the communities in which we're operating that need to be considered. We have the consumers that need these metals and need them in accordance with very stringent and specific requirements that are evolving and adapting, or making sure that from a societal perspective, we don't have a negative impact. We have the environmental aspect. You know, I personally and my team do not want to go in and, as people have said, you know, destroy the ocean. That is not our intention. Our intention is far more pragmatic. We need these resources, and we know they sit in the sea floor. How can we get to them to the benefit of the human race without having negative impact? And then, of course, the other thing is from the commercial side. You know, business is about economics. It is about profitability, and we have to address all of that. So, as an organization out there looking to develop these mineral resources, I have an incredibly diverse set of stakeholders that we need to look at. And our objective and our goal is to, at this very early stage, because we are developing a new frontier, a new environment, is let's engage with everybody. Let's get all of these different views together, and let's come up with a pragmatic and well thought out set of guidelines and goals and objectives that we all agree on. And let's go forward and make sure that we can access this resource, bring these metals to the market, not to replace what is existing on land, but to augment what is there, not to replace the circular economy. The circular economy needs to get critical mass and has to, once it has got critical mass, is going to have to continually be topped up. You know, we don't see the seafloor minerals as a replacement. We see seafloor minerals together with everything else as the way of the future. Without it, we don't get to where we want to be. So our approach is to go into this development of this new industry to address issues that have been raised. We also admit and realize that there is a knowledge gap. There is a need for information. And as Prime Minister Mark Brown said, you know, substantial amounts of our budgets are spent on environmental research, on other research initiatives to make sure that across the supply chain, not only, you know, from the harvesting or the extraction, but also through to the, you know, how the metals are extracted and the waste products that are produced, that the impact that we have is kept to the minimum, that we do not do serious harm, and that we ensure that this process, when looked at by all from different aspects, can see that we have done our work and we have ensured that the impact and the footprint that we are leaving is kept to the minimum. We want to do it in a transparent manner. We want to engage with all the stakeholders. And as I've already said, stakeholders are across the spectrum, you know, whether it's NGOs, the communities, regulatory bodies, we want to engage with all. We are using an ecosystem-based model as our approach. And the reason we're using this is because it clearly identifies where we have gaps. We have got programs in place to address those gaps, build up this knowledge so that when we do come with the technology that we're going to use to harvest these nodules, we can actually measure and quantify the impacts that may be happening. And we can then sit and evaluate that and make a science and fact-based decision as to whether those impacts are within acceptable boundaries that have been agreed with the various stakeholders. And we apply the principles of adaptive management. We know that we don't know everything. We know that this is an evolution. This is an ongoing growing process. And part of that growing process is, as we learn more, to go back to what our thinking is, to go back to what we are using as the metrics and to adapt them. In some cases, we may be able to reduce the levels. In other cases, we may have to raise them. But that is all part of the process that we want to follow going forward. And I think, finally, this is a great opportunity for, rather than the communities in which we operate and work and where these minerals are sourced, being on the outside and looking in, this is an opportunity for them to become integrated and involved in this, particularly in our project in the Cook Islands, where there is such a cultural connection to the ocean. So I think the message that I'm trying to share with everybody today is that I think where we find ourselves is that our view is that we have to have these metals and these minerals in order to achieve these goals that have been set to keep climate change within normal bounds and within control. They are essential, they are needed. But what we need to do is we need to come together and discuss in an open, transparent manner how we are going to go forward doing this, and come together with a plan that allows everybody's interests to be met, but in a manner that allows all stakeholders, whether you are for or against, to be able to move this process forward in a meaningful manner. We are committed to going forward with this process towards the decision point. And that decision point is, will we be able to put a system in place that can harvest these minerals in a manner that satisfies the various stakeholders? Does it make money? Is it economic? Does it supply the metals that the world needs, but also make sure that we have zero harm and that the communities benefit? When we get to that point, we will then have a fact-based decision-making process that will determine whether we go mining. At the moment, I think there's a lot of talk about the harm that mining is going to do, but nobody's talking about mining yet. We are still talking about the research to get to decide whether we do go mining. But what we are asking is that let's not sit and argue against one another. Let's sit together and debate and come up with a solution that at least takes care of this existential problem we face with regards to climate change and the need to transition to this clean energy and source the metals from the ocean that are going to be essential to make that happen. Thanks.
Hans, thank you. I think you really sort of, I think, reflect the terms of the debate that we've been having so far, and I think it really is crystallizing on this knowledge gap, whether that be scientific and environmental, whether that be social, whether that be also economic. And I think certainly as we look ahead to our discussion shortly, I think one of the questions that emerges and occurs to me is we clearly have an understanding that we need to build the knowledge, we need to further develop the knowledge, and it's really how we go about doing that, who is driving that research agenda almost. But I think obviously we have a few more contributions to go before we get to that discussion. And I'd really like to hand over the floor to Professor Alex Rogers to really share his perspective, and I think to build on what was being said. So Alex, the floor is yours for 5 minutes or so. Thank you.
Many thanks, and thanks to the Cobalt Institute for inviting us here today to talk to you. I think I'd like to start just by saying that, of course, we're not just talking about nodules here in terms of deep sea mineral extraction. In the case of cobalt, we're also talking about cobalt crusts on seamount ecosystems as well. So this is not just about the abyssal plains. This is also about some of the richest ecosystems in the ocean, our underwater mountains. I would like to follow up on what Adrian was saying about life in the deep ocean. The research that has been done in the CCFZ over the past 20 years or so has really started to show us more about what life is like down there. We understand now that there is a high biodiversity of organisms living both in the sediments surrounding the manganese nodules, but also actually on the nodules themselves. And here we have a distributed megafauna organisms like sponges, corals, sea anemones, and other animals which live on those nodules. On seamounts, the difference is that the communities are very much dominated by hard substrates, so rocky seafloors, which are richly colonized with marine life, both living on the seafloor and also surrounding those seamount ecosystems. And those have been the targets of fishing in the deep ocean probably since the 1960s. So a very different system, one which for many reasons is extremely vulnerable to mining with really significant consequences, both for biodiversity, but also in terms of the way the ocean works. Life in the deep sea operates in a very, very different way to we're used to the way life operates on land or in shallow water. The oldest known deep sea organism to date is a sponge that's found in the South China Sea. We think it lives for 11,000 years. There are corals that live in these environments which live for 3,000 to 4,000 years, fish which live for hundreds of years. Life, because of the low food supply that Adrian mentioned, moves at a very, very slow pace. Animals grow very slowly, they're very slow to reproduce. So when there are impacts on the deep sea, the ecosystems which are impacted are very slow to recover. And in fact, from what we've seen, some of them don't appear to recover at all, at least not in human timescales. I've been rather perplexed at the terminology used here in terms of harvesting deep sea nodules. Those nodules take millions of years to grow. They're not harvested, they are extracted, as one of the previous speakers stated. Modelling studies have indicated that the removal of these nodules remove important components of those deep sea communities, and that results in a loss of something like 1/4 to 1/3 of the species in the areas that are potentially mined. Of course, we don't know for sure what's going to happen to this seafloor life, but those are what the modelling studies are telling us. And we also know from experiments which were carried out several decades ago that the seafloor does not recover to its previous state following mining, at least over those timescales. So this is what we do know. What we don't know is pretty vast. There are large knowledge gaps here in terms of what actually lives in the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone, on seamounts and other deep sea ecosystems potentially impacted by mining, should it go ahead at commercial scale. We are starting to get clues about the diversity of life by using DNA studies. Those DNA studies, something that's called eDNA or environmental DNA approaches, don't tell us about the biological functions of those organisms within ecosystems. They're like the barcodes in a supermarket. They tell you that you have different items, but they don't tell you what those items do. So we do have these significant knowledge gaps. That's not just about the seafloor, it's also about the impacts of mining on the water column. This is the largest ecosystem on Earth, about 1.3 billion cubic kilometers of water. What we also know from projects like the Ocean Biodiversity Information System is that the water column is the least understood and least studied ecosystem on Earth as well. So the effects of mining plumes and noise and so on are certainly not understood in terms of water column ecology. And of course, this has the potential to impact important processes such as carbon cycling, as well as fish populations. And certainly CCFZ is subject in some parts to significant levels of fishing for tuna. But following up on some of the comments I've seen in the chat here and also on what's been said today, I would like to just point out what's happened previously when we've gone into the deep sea looking for resources, even in a situation where we've had UNCLOS supposedly governing what's happened. And the case I would like to just point to is that of deep sea fishing. Here we have a set of regulations about fishing embodied in the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. That did not stop completely unregulated fishing from happening in the deep sea, with huge destruction both to the target fish populations, but also to the seafloor communities where this fishing was taking place, because a lot of it was undertaken by deep sea trawling. And indeed, the Cook Islands and other states were involved in that activity. And it took many decades for scientists to understand what the impacts of that activity actually were, and then more time for governments to actually react and try and regulate in a more sensible fashion what was going on with that industry. I've seen the rather amusing comment about circular economy meaning no growth in terms of our economies. Let me just put you in a very clear picture of where the current model of a growth economy has got us. In 20 years, our GDP has grown globally by 100%. However, 40% of nature has been lost as a result of that model of growth economy. So are we going to carry on in the same fashion into the future with this same model of economic growth? At what point do we decide that, enough is enough? We don't have, 50, 60, 70, 80% of our biodiversity. And with that, all the ecosystem functions and services that biodiversity provides for us. I would like to just finish by saying we are facing two crises in the world at the moment. One is the climate crisis. The other one is a biodiversity crisis. The ocean, we have described something like 10% of the diversity that is there. And to make a significant impact on our understanding of biodiversity in the ocean, we're talking about a project which probably has a similar scale of cost to one of the current large space missions, several $1 billion. But when you think about what that would actually achieve for us, the ability to manage the ocean in a much better way, maybe some of our attention should be focused on rectifying that as a knowledge gap, rather than pursuing some of the things which are being looked at the moment. So that's where I'd like to end.
Thank you so much. I think you really again shed light on the issue, on that idea of the knowledge gap, but also maybe a fundamental challenge for society to sort of think about our models of growth and our models of continued development. But I think coming to our final sort of contributor this morning before we get into some of that discussion is Alex Herman from the Cook Islands Seabed Authority. I think really brings us full circle, Alex, from the contribution from the Prime Minister earlier through the debate with the colleagues this morning around sort of the science, the economics, the social, of course. And would perhaps sort of give the floor to you to sort of reflect and ruminate on some of those points before we can then start addressing some of the questions that come up. So, Alex, and again, thank you so much for taking the time at a very odd hour for you. Are you on mute?
There we go.
There we go. Okay.
Yes, Yes, indeed, Adam. And it has been a really robust and interesting discussion so far. Kia ora, greetings everyone tuning into this webinar. In the Cook Islands, it is currently midnight, but not to worry, I promise you all I'll stay alert and awake. But before I begin, I would like to thank the Cobalt Institute for organising this webinar. I am grateful for the opportunity to share briefly on the Cook Islands experience. And as you would have heard from our Prime Minister's speech, the Cook Islands, like many Pacific countries, has a close relationship with our ocean. Today, we still draw cultural, social, economic, and environmental values from the ocean. So our role and responsibility as custodians of our marae moana is an important one for us. You heard earlier that for decades we've known about polymetallic nodules within our waters, and it's in recent years that we have been taking careful steps to developing the seabed sector. Now, the most significant and recent milestone has been the issuing of 3 exploration licenses, including one to one of our panel speakers, Moana Minerals. Now, these companies not only met our requirements, but importantly understand and accept the Cook Islands' values and goals in developing this sector. There have been some queries regarding the use of the term harvesting, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it is a term that is used beyond just crops. If you look up one definition of harvest in the Cambridge Dictionary, it is to collect a natural resource in order to use it effectively. Although I would welcome a separate conversation on terminologies another day. If we can move on to the next slide, please. I do want to talk briefly to Cook Islands Seabed Mineral Sustainability Goals. Now, environmental protection, this is one we can all agree on is a fundamental goal across all of the stakeholders involved in seabed minerals development. And we've heard mention of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which also enshrines this and ensures that no activities which could cause serious harm to the marine environment are allowed. And again, I'd like to reiterate the point as to where we are currently. There has, at this point in time, no decisions have been made on whether to allow exploitation to go ahead. A key one for the Cook Islands has been people empowerment. We are very clear that we are building the seabed minerals sector for the benefit of our Cook Islands people. This is what has driven our stakeholder and community engagement, and that is what I want to talk about a little later. Of course, economic diversity, you heard that being spoken about by the Prime Minister. And for years, the Cook Islands has been heavily reliant on our tourism industry. Now, we are a country that is 0.01% land and 99.99% ocean. So it is inevitable that we would turn to our ocean for our future sustainable development and solutions. Another goal or key aspect you heard spoken about during this webinar has been the advancement of scientific knowledge. And I believe that was Adrian who touched on this. There is still so much that we do not know about our own marae moana. And through our 3 license holders, they will contribute nearly $200 million combined over the next 5 years in their exploration research programs. That is of huge significance to the Cook Islands, and learning, this journey that we're going to be on for the next 5 years is exciting for us. Another goal is the contribution towards the low carbon economy, and we've heard some discussion on that. And of course, I accept that there are more studies needed to better understand whether the use of the metals from nodules can actually contribute towards the green transition. But I will say that initial studies to date are encouraging. And as a small island state, the Cook Islands currently experience the impacts of climate change through, for example, sea level rise. Next slide, please. Now, you heard earlier, Prime Minister Brown spoke to the keys to building a sustainable and responsible seabed sector. We've heard all of our previous speakers touch on some of these points, or if not all of them. So I won't speak to them in detail, but I will expand further on bringing our people along the journey. I do think that the Cook Islands is unique, or can share some insights as far as our stakeholder engagement is concerned. Now, before I do touch on that, I do also want to raise two related matters that we heard earlier in the webinar. The first is that I think we can all agree that there are knowledge gaps in understanding our marine environment and the potential impacts. Now, important to closing those knowledge gaps is going to be exploration research activities, as well as testing and trials, which are going to be critical for governments like the Cook Islands and authorities, so that they have the information and knowledge needed to make informed science-based decisions. We've also heard statements in this webinar around looking into alternative technologies, changing the way we produce and consume, as well as the circular economy. I agree we should do that, but I would, being mindful of the expected global metal demands in future years, I think or my proposal at least, is that rather than choosing one or the other, it is in society's best interests to continue exploring all of the available options and technologies, and not to halt one potential industry or technology prematurely. Next slide. And so this brings me to one of the keys that I wanted to expand on, which is the Cook Islands stakeholder engagement. This has been an ongoing for decades since we first became aware of nodules, and of course before the Seabed Minerals Authority was established in 2013. As this sector has progressed and developed, we have stepped up our efforts. In particular, last year, which you see here is a snapshot of our community consultations. It was a critical year for us, as that was marked by our exploration licensing process. And last year, we reached 12 of our 13 inhabited islands. Now, these islands are spread across our 2 million square kilometre EEZ. Some of these islands are only reachable by boat. And so we, as I said, it is our priority has been our people. And so we have made that effort to ensure that we are engaging with them and meeting them and going to them. So the range of stakeholder groups that we have engaged with include our 3 pillars and our grassroots communities. I do want to mention that here in the Cook Islands, our 3 pillars of society are our government leaders, our religious and traditional leaders. You can also see from the screen, we undertook surveys, and this was really to help us get an idea of how to better improve our engagement. For example, what we found with our engagement with our grassroots people is that they prefer it when we deliver our presentations in Cook Islands Māori, which is what we will continue to do. And the main feedback we received from our surveys last year, and from discussions with people in the consultations, is that they have thanked us and appreciated us for the effort that we have made towards reaching out to them and letting them know what is happening and trying to help them understand what it's all about, really. For myself personally, I have enjoyed each and every one of these consultations because it means that one extra Cook Islander at least has a better understanding of what Seabed Minerals is about. But we also have gotten really good questions and suggestions from our Cook Islands people. They've expressed quite clear views in terms of Seabed Minerals issues, including on our regulatory regime, opportunities for our Cook Islands people, and environmental protection, to name a few. And they've shared this with us, and we've taken that on board. So as far as stakeholder engagement, I have a few takeaway points. The first is seabed minerals is a complex issue. And so you've already heard some of that being touched on in the webinar. And you also are aware that there are different resources across different scales in different regions. And so for us, the challenge when we are engaging with our Cook Islands communities is in breaking down those concepts so that they can understand it and therefore be able to engage in it. So stakeholder mapping and planning is important. Equally important is how are we integrating that stakeholder feedback into our decision-making and our future planning for the sector. Looking ahead, I can see that the 3 license holders will also have their own separate responsibilities to engage with Cook Islands communities because of this new phase that we're entering into. But overall, I'm happy with where we're heading in terms of our stakeholder engagement. Of course, there are definitely areas for improvement, and that's something that we will continue to work on and revisit. Next slide, please. So those were really, in a nutshell, some of the key points that I wanted to touch on. We've heard a lot of discussion around stakeholder engagement, so I thought it would be valuable to add the Cook Islands experience as far as that is concerned. But me taki mata to everyone. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for sort of touching on, I think, one of the critical areas we've heard here, which is around sort of ensuring that the sort of the impact to communities understand and potentially have a view on what is the right way forward potentially. So that really, I think, brings us to the end of sort of the contributions from the panel, and just looking here at some of the comments that are coming in from our audience, it's clearly raised quite a number of issues. I think a sort of first question or comment I would have from my side for the panel would really be around this knowledge gap. And I think I'm also trying to summarise some of the comments we've had in the chat from our audience. But I think we all agree, it seems to me at least, that there is a knowledge gap. That is both environmental, scientific, that is certainly social, and also I think economic. And you know, we all agree that we want to close that knowledge gap. So sort of I think a multifaceted sort of question around that is that if we all can agree on that, how are we going to close that? Is there a way of having, you know, almost a centralized way of driving this research agenda, or are we still sort of looking for sort of various different parties to be contributing that knowledge? Do we need to agree on a defined almost set of questions that we don't know today the answer to? Linked to that, and coming from the chat, I mean, can we see a role as Alex or as Hans have described, of these exploration licenses contributing to that knowledge, to building that and closing that gap? And how can we make sure that they're answering the right questions, I think, as we think about that? And then other sort of questions that have come in, which I thought was quite an interesting one. What lessons can we learn from what have already been done? I mean, I think Alex mentioned the example of deep sea fishing and the harm that appears to have done. What lessons can we take from other sectors to help us close that gap? For example, the deep sea oil drilling. Is there any lessons to be learned there? So I think there's 3 or 4 different questions that I've tried to bundle together there a little bit. Perhaps I'll sort of do it slightly randomly, but perhaps as she started and had been silent, perhaps I'd ask Winnie to sort of, for her perspectives on that, and perhaps followed by Jessica for a sort of ideas around how do we close that gap? When do we know enough, I guess? So Winnie and then perhaps Jessica.
Great, thank you, Adam. So focusing on one part of your question, when do we know enough? This is something our report identified as a consensus gap. So as you said, and as everyone today has touched on, we know we don't have enough knowledge, and it requires a lot to get this knowledge. So the key question is, when is enough knowledge? And what we found is that there is no consensus on how much knowledge is considered enough knowledge. In our interviews for the paper, we've heard stakeholders that said, they want to see consensus between scientists, and that's when they consider it's enough knowledge. We've heard some stakeholders said what they consider enough knowledge is when they've reached the requirements listed by the regulators. There is not a consensus today on how much knowledge is enough knowledge. And part of answering the knowledge question is also building consensus. So we believe more dialogue is needed, and parties need to come across the different aisles. When they see a report coming out that tries to view this topic with impartial lens, I ask you to not look at it from where you're sitting and finding the things that confirm what you already believe, but think about what is new on this and what are some questions the other side may be asking that you haven't asked. So in the end, more discussion is needed, more dialogue instead of debate is needed to have more consensus to help close the knowledge gap.
Please.
You want to go next?
Yes, sorry.
No worries. No, thank you so much. I'll answer that question partially. I think that what is really important is that it's not just about the amount of knowledge, it's also about what kind of knowledge, right? So some of the research that is being done is not including all the disciplines that need to be included in order to have the knowledge needed. So I think that is one thing. What are the questions that are being asked and who is answering these questions? So I think that is really important to have multidisciplinary research teams and that they are not only answering questions pertaining to mining and the minerals, but broader on the ecosystem services that might be affected as well. And this is really important, I think. A lot of the research so far has been done by geologists and by deep sea biologists, and perhaps a little bit less on the impacts on fisheries, the impacts broader on carbon sequestrations, etc. So I think multidisciplinary research teams that themselves formulate the questions rather than the industry, I think is very important. But I would actually also like to just put another thought experiment out there, if you don't mind, and I don't think we have time to answer it, but I would actually like to ask, what about if we didn't know that there was minerals in the deep sea? How would we then do our switch to a low carbon economy? I think that is a really important thought experiment as well, considering the lack of knowledge that we have and the knowledge we have that points to devastating effects on the ocean ecosystem and on climate regulation from seabed mining. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Maybe Hans, I could sort of ask you, I mean, obviously, as you look at your exploration now and into the future, you're obviously looking at this research, this growing body of knowledge. I mean, where are you seeing the gaps? What do you see that needs to be further done, and how do we go about that in a almost a collective way that means that everyone is moving towards that consensus that Winnie mentioned?
Yeah, Adam, I think two things. The first one is stakeholder engagement, and to Winnie's point, stakeholder engagement of all the right stakeholders. We need to make sure that all the affected parties are at the table and they get an opportunity to bring their concerns and their ideas to the table. And if you look at our process going forward, and we've just completed our planning for the next 3 to 5 years, the very first step that we have is stakeholder engagement, and stakeholder engagement is across the board. We have the communities, we have the NGOs, we have representation from industry, the regulators. We need to have everybody sitting at the table and discussing this and contributing this in a transparent manner with the objective of defining and setting the needs or the questions that need to be answered. So I think that's a very important part, and it's a key part of what we're already engaging in and we're moving forward. I think the other thing that, to Jessica's point about we've been doing it incorrectly, I would argue that that is not the case. If you look at how we are going forward, we are using the ecosystem-based model as the guidance for the research that we need to do. So we are not just looking at very specific studies in order to, as we've been accused of in the past, just answer the questions in order to get the right answer.
Oh, I think we've, unfortunately, Hans is frozen. So maybe I could sort of put a similar question to...
we look at, the impacts on the different biota, but we can also look at the social aspects and the economic aspects. And we want to develop this ecosystem model using data that is collected. And the reason we've gone with this model is it gives us a great ability to identify where the gaps exist. Where are the knowledge deficiencies, so that we can ensure that our research campaigns and our operations are adjusted and driven in order to answer those questions. It's important at the end of the day that when we make a decision as to whether we are or are not going to go forward with extraction of these nodules, we are doing it based on scientific data, based on metrics that have been brought to the table and used to make this decision, that has been agreed to by the various stakeholders that would be impacted by this process.
Hans, thank you. And maybe a sort of that same question to the people who are actually seeking to build that knowledge, that research, to both Adrian and Alex. I mean, how the research you conduct, how is that sort of, are you looking at your own specific questions, research agendas, or is there a broader emerging consensus that you see that there is a set of questions that we need to answer, that we need to address before we can even get close to making that go or no-go decision? I don't know. Or is it still very diverse? There's so many things we've yet to address that it's still going to take us time to answer that question. I don't know, maybe Alex and then Adrian?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think the bottom line is that there are some very fundamental scientific questions that us scientists love because they get us nice scientific papers, which are very relevant and important to consideration of deep sea mining. Number one among those is, what is the distribution of life in the ocean? Where do we find species? What is the range across which those species live? So, for example, do species live in just a small patch of ocean space? Are they found across an entire ocean or even across multiple oceans? And that, of course, has a major impact on the way that you think about how to manage a process which impacts on the seafloor or the water column. So that's a big question. And I think we've just seen a paper recently which attempted to use eDNA to try and answer that question. What that paper has demonstrated to us is, well, it's confirmed we don't know much of the life that lives in the ocean at these depths, but it also suggests that the patterns of distribution are more complex than we previously realized, with much more locality in terms of distribution of life. So I think that's a really important question. The other really important one is, what does this life do? What are the roles of these species in the ecosystem, and how does that play a role in terms of ecosystem services, i.e. those organisms carrying out functions which have value to us humans. And I don't just mean monetary value, I mean in terms of supporting the Earth's life support system, if you like. I think that's another major question that has real bearing on this whole question. And I'd just like to add one comment, which I noted in the chat. Deep sea research is expensive. We're talking about scientific cruises that cost $1 to $2 million plus, depending on what ship and what equipment you're deploying. And that also has implications on who is going to pay for monitoring the impact of an activity like deep sea mining. This is not cheap to do, at least not at the moment.
Alex, thank you. And I think that does ultimately come to a point of how do we do that? Who is going to support and fund that? But Adrian, so sort of similar question to you, and then I think I'll come back to Alex from a sort of regulator perspective. But Adrian, please.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's a good point. So I think this knowledge gap thing comes up time and time again. I'm asked many times by journalists, well, how many years will it be until you have enough knowledge? And of course, it's become a kind of a joke in deep sea mining circles. It's always 10 years away. So you always just say 10 years. But the actual reality is, of course, it's not an absolute number. It's just it depends on where you want to be, and then you work out what level of funding is required to get there. So, for example, just to take an example, we're talking about the conservation regions, these regions which have been set aside, and that's already happened in a policy framework in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. Very forward-thinking, sort of precautionary-based approach, saying let's set aside on basically very simplistic kind of model parameters regions which wouldn't be impacted. And therefore, you can come up with a logical kind of question, which is if you mined X kilometers squared of the contracted area and set aside, the other 40% or whatever for as a conservation region, what would be the degree of risk of extinctions of animals? And in some regions, we're getting closer to that. Certainly in the eastern Clarion-Clipperton Zone, the intensity of research in the German areas, the NORI-D area, the UK area, the Belgian area, there's been a lot of work and a lot of published work, and it's getting closer. The biggest gap actually now is not the knowledge inside the potential mining regions, it's the knowledge in the set-aside conservation areas, these so-called APEIs. And we'll have the same issues and we'll have to deal with the same problems when we work in somewhere like the Cook Islands, that you have to also do research it's a very basic kind of experimental ecology, really. You need to have a control site as well as an impacted site that you survey. And so that is a big gap. And it's actually very challenging to look to industry to survey those regions as well. It's just the sheer cost of it, as Alex mentioned, it's these vast sums of money. A day of ship time is hundreds of thousands of dollars on one of these big ships. So we do have to apply pressure. This International Seabed Authority and small island developing states, they don't have big oceanographic research ships and government agencies stuffed full of scientists. We have to look at the few places where they exist, and the United States being an obvious one nearby, and try and apply pressure to those organizations and those governments to get that research done, and particularly in those conservation zones, so we can actually make that estimate and provide that data on what the extinction risks would be, for X and Y size mined area. So I don't sort of see this kind of I don't kind of adhere to the statement that, that we can never proceed because there'll never be enough knowledge. It's a relatively tractable problem. It just requires funding and investment. And to be fair, the contractors have done a lot of work in those contracted regions, and we need to match that in the conserved regions as well to be able to come up with some good numbers. So whether it's 10 years or 1 year or whatever depends on your simply on how much effort we put into it. I mean, you have to remember, just take a contextual look at this. Everyone said it would be impossible to make a COVID vaccine, in 6 months' time, but we did that simply because the effort was put into it. And if society is serious about doing this right, then we need to know what animals live in these environments and what the extinction risk would be, and it requires a considerable amount of investment. And if this ends up being a multi-billion or trillion-dollar industry, getting that done now seems entirely sensible and entirely practical.
Adrian, thank you. And then Alex, from a sort of a regulator perspective, how do you perceive this gap? How are you sort of looking to ask the various parties to help you close areas that you don't know about, with the questions you get in from your stakeholder engagement with your communities? How are you able to sort of push that into that research field, and also then to, I guess, cope with the work that's being done? Because I imagine there's quite a lot happening. There's quite a lot of information you need to analyze and synthesize. How are you able to sort of approach that from your perspective?
Yes, thanks, Adam. And I do want to thank the earlier comments from our speakers, because I do agree. And it's interesting that, the earlier comments talked about divergence and debates. But essentially, there is that existing consensus around the way forward. So we heard earlier around multidisciplinary research teams and taking an open and transparent approach to engagement with stakeholders. And I fully agree with all of those earlier comments. Adrian touched on some of the challenges and issues for Pacific Island states, and I also agree with those sentiments as well. For us, we're still continuing to build our institutional capacity. For the Cook Islands, extractive industries is not one that we've traditionally been a part of. So what's been important for us is building partnerships and collaborating with the various stakeholders, and then helping facilitate the engagement between stakeholders. So for the Cook Islands, our stakeholders aren't just our communities, industry and NGOs, but we are also partnering with other governments. We have existing and long-standing relationships with countries such as New Zealand, Australia, the US, and other countries. And we've been, as we've been developing our sector, we've been building on those partnerships as well, so that we also have that capability to participate in this sector. So it's not just about building the knowledge and understanding of our communities, but it's also for us as regulators. I do want to touch on just coming back to the points around knowledge gaps. At the moment, the Cook Islands knowledge of its marine environment is probably low compared to, say, research that's been carried out in the CCZ. But of course, over the next couple of years, our knowledge is going to increase. And we are already partnering up with other institutions that are going to assist us when it comes time to making decisions as to what are the next steps. But I'm not going to delve into the when decisions get made. I don't, Adrian talked about there's always 10 more years and 10 more years. So we don't really look at timeframes, but we more are looking at, from our perspective, when are we going to be in a position where we believe that we have enough information to make an informed decision. And at this stage, until we have more exploration activities which give us more data, I don't think that it's appropriate for us to comment on that. But I can say that we will draw on the experiences and the knowledge learnt from other areas such as the CCZ, because of course there are nodules there. Thank you.
Alex, thank you. So I really think we're kind of 10 minutes or so over our allotted time. And whilst we still have a number of questions that have come in from our audience, want to be respectful of our panelists' time and also time differences. But I really think we've touched on a lot of the issues that have struck us at the Institute since we've been looking at this. I mean, one of the driving factors that led us to host the webinar is just the fact that we really wanted to understand the debate. We wanted to understand where things stood, because obviously from a Cobalt perspective, this is something that is mentioned increasingly. I think we saw the article in the LA Times in the last 24 hours. We see regularly stories around, availability of metals, availability of cobalt. So it's an emerging question that we really wanted to try and understand ourselves. And I think today we've touched on a lot of the key and critical points, particularly around that need for building knowledge, building consensus, and engaging with the various stakeholders. And obviously, today is not you know, the last time we as an organisation will talk about this, and we'll be sort of delving more into the topic, because it is, you know, a fascinating topic from whatever angle one might consider it from. But I think for today, I would thank our panellists for taking the time, for their contributions. I would thank our audience for the quite lively chats we've been seeing, and hope that they've taken something away from the conversations today. Would remind everyone that, as mentioned at the beginning, this is the first in a series of events we will be holding over the next sort of 8 weeks or so. The next one will be our conference in May in Zurich, and you can find more information on our website. But we'd thank everyone for the time today, and look forward to our next debate and discussions, and wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.